Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and we are starting week 5 of our study. So I wanted to spend a few moments talking about some things about the post-Revolutionary War that maybe you haven't heard before, maybe would be helpful to you. You're going to be discussing some of those things this week in the materials, and I hope that you'll be ready for test 2, which also comes this week. So make ready for that. Most of my notes will not be on the test. Those tests come from your reading and materials internally. So I wouldn't worry too much about the things we talk about today. There is a very awkward interregnum between the end of the Revolutionary War in 1781 and 1783, where we finally get a treaty with the British. And then it's going to be 1787 before the Continental Congress will meet to discuss what they're going to do about operating as a country. And then, of course, that Constitution will finally be ratified in 1789. So we don't become the United States of America for almost a decade. And so you don't hear much about that. It's not often talked about. But this is a gap in time that I think is most interesting. The surrender of Yorktown of but the Treaty of Paris was not signed, as I said, until September of 1783, nearly 2 years of limbo. During that gap, the Continental Army nearly mutinied at Newburgh, New York. Officers threatened a coup over unpaid wages and over pensions. Washington's dramatic personal intervention at Newburgh, uh, pulling out his spectacles and saying, or pulling off his spectacles and saying that he had grown old in the service, diffused the crisis, and many may have saved the Republican government. Great doors hang on small hinges sometimes, and that's one of those events. Congress was so broken, so broke it in June of 1783 when unpaid Pennsylvania soldiers surrounded the State House demanding back pay. So it wasn't a panacea during this period of time. The 13 colonies existed and operated under a document called the Articles of Confederation. This was the America's first government. The articles had been ratified in March of 1781. So the new nation did have a governing document, but it was deliberately weak because they still had great fears of Republican power or having a king. They still weren't sure what kind of government they wanted. They had no power to tax directly, only to requisition funds from states, which routinely ignored those requests. There was no executive branch, there was no federal judiciary. Every state had one vote, regardless of population. And 9 of the 13 states were required to pass any major legislation. Congress could not regulate interstate or foreign commerce. The result was you had 13 sovereign states, which I often say started their own countries because each of them had to have diplomatic corps. They had to have agreements with trade around whoever they traded with. And so that we had 13 small countries trying to do those kind of things. So what were they actually doing? Well, first of all, they were demobilizing an army with no money to pay it. They were watching hyperinflation destroy the paper currency. The saying "not worth a continental" came to be the same thing, saying "not worth a buck or a dollar." Negotiating mostly unsuccessfully with Britain and France and Spain from a position of near total weakness. So winning the war was one thing, existing after the war was quite different. Watching states erect tariff walls against each other, uh, like foreign nations, was another issue that came up. Dealing with the Shays Rebellion, 1786 to 1787 in Massachusetts, debt-ridden farmers are shutting down courts and threatening the arsenal at Springfield. Congress could not respond because they had no money and no army. So it was a problem. Shays Rebellion was the political earthquake that made the Constitutional Convention feel urgent and necessary. So Shays Rebellion was a catalyst toward moving us toward deciding how we were going to operate. The Continental Congress, the Constitutional Congress, actually met 1787 to 1789 at the Philadelphia Convention. It convened in May of 1787 to revise ostensibly the Articles of Confederation. Delegates quickly agreed they needed to scrap them entirely because they were virtually worthless. You had 55 delegates and 39 signed the new Constitution. Notably absent included Patrick Henry. He said, I smell a rat, and Thomas Jefferson, who was in Paris, and John Adams, who was in London. So these great old uh, members of the founding fathers were not in attendance. The great compromise that made the Constitution work, called the Connecticut Compromise, broke the deadlock between large and small states because that was the argument. You had big states like Pennsylvania, you had very small states like Massachusetts, Delaware, New Hampshire, and the amount of representation in a legislative body was a major issue because small states did not want to be overlooked and large states overpower everything. But this Connecticut compromise and between these states broke that. And that was a bicameral, or a two-part legislature with proportional representation in the House and equal representation in the Senate. So basically, every state, no matter its size, gets two senators. So there's 100 senators today, and the House of Representatives got representation based on population. Another point of interest was the three-fifths compromise that said that enslaved persons counted as three-fifths of a person. So slaves were not counted as whole persons. It finished in 1787. Then the ratification battle started from that. It required 9 of 13 states. That was not a guarantee it's going to happen. Federalists like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay produced the Federalist Papers, these 85 essays arguing for ratification, still the important commentary, and it's still the most important commentary on the Constitution that's ever been written. So it's well worth reading. Anti-Federalist, that means those against federal power. Patrick Henry, George Mason, Richard Henry Lee warned of tyranny, a distant central government, the absence of a Bill of Rights, and there were certain states that were a very close call as to whether they would vote or not. Virginia, New York, ratified by very razor thin edges. Ratification finally achieved in June of 1788. New Hampshire was the ninth state. The government operational began in March of 1789. One of the things that helped get the Constitution passed was the Bill of Rights. 10 amendments ratified December of 1791 at the price of anti-federalist support, which gave people certain rights. So, like, right to bear arms, right to freedom of religion, those kind of things that are still talked about. There were some new organizational realities that maybe we haven't thought about. Creation of 3 branches with checks and balances. That was absolutely novel in the world of history at that point in time. Nobody had ever done that. An elected executive with real power, but not a king. Washington's 2-term precedent became as important as the Constitution itself. Washington did 2 things that has prefigured up until recently. Number one, he resigned his commission in the Army because he did not feel like the Army, that the leader should have an army at his back if we're going to have a free government. And he limited himself to 2 terms because he said we need to see a rational transition of power take place. And so after 2 terms, he resigned and we had an election. We had a federal judiciary culminating in a Supreme Court. Marbury versus Madison, 1803, established judicial review, a power not explicitly given in the Constitution. The first cabinet Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Treasury was Hamilton. Secretary of War was Knox. Attorney General was Randolph. 4 men had enormous disagreements over how things should operate. I will say this, that one of the great organizers of this new government was Alexander Hamilton, who is virtually an unknown founding father, but probably one of the most important. And he would be killed in a duel with Aaron Burr, who was a former vice president, over Hamilton throwing his votes in a tied election when it went to the legislature to decide. Hamilton convinced people to vote for Jefferson and not Burr, and Burr killed him in a duel, which was there was a lot of dueling at that time. Andrew Jackson will be the other guy who likes dueling. So basically, that was first cabinet. New realities of national life. First of all, there's a financial crisis, and Hamilton's vision really pulled us through that. The new nation was essentially bankrupt. Hamilton's report on public credit in 1790 proposed assuming all state debts at face value. And that was deeply controversial. The debts from the war, basically, and rather than all the individual states trying to pay them off, put them together. Compromise of 1790, Hamilton got his debt assumption. Jefferson and Madison got the national capital moved to the Potomac, Washington, D.C., which was a part of Virginia at that time. And Virginia will dominate the first presidential elections. Washington, not Adams, he's New Englander, then Jefferson, and so they will be the Virginia cadre will become a thing, but that was the trade-off. Hamilton's National Bank, protective tariff, and manufacturing encouragement created the framework for American capitalism and the first major constitutional debate over implied powers. Jefferson and Madison's opposition crystallized into the Democratic Republican Party. And this would be the first American party system was born out of Hamilton's program. And then, of course, in 1824, with the loss of his election there, Andrew Jackson will form with Martin Van Buren, who was also a former president, a Democratic Party. So the first presidency and the precedents that were set, always the first step is always important, but Washington was painfully aware he was setting precedents with every action. He said, I walk on untrodden ground. The cabinet system, the State of the Union address, the veto, two-term limit, and unwritten norms that were established by Washington during his presidency. In 1794, one of the big tests of Washington's presidency was the Whiskey Rebellion. Western Pennsylvania farmers rebelled against Hamilton's excise tax, and so Washington led 13,000 troops into the field, demonstrating the new government would enforce its laws, and that was the direct answer to the Shays Rebellion. This new government also had to think about relations with the world. We had Britain, who was an unfinished enemy. Britain never fully complied with the Treaty of Paris, retained frontier forts in the Northwest Territory around Detroit, Niagara, and so on American soil. The British impressment of American soldiers, they were our sailors, they were bad to stop American ships, and if they found a sailor with a British accent, which they mainly all had British accents because we were British, they treated naturalized American citizens as British subjects and would steal them to be on their ships. And this was a running sore point that became a big deal. Jay's Treaty of 1794 was deeply unpopular. It secured British evacuation of the forts, but conceded much. Washington's support of it nearly destroyed his popularity. Britain continued to view the United States as an economic dependent and a geopolitical nuisance. France was an ally, of course, but a very complicated one. The French Revolution of 1789, which came as a result of the American Revolution, created an ideological fault line in American politics. Jeffersonians sympathized with revolutionary France. The Federalists were horrified. We had the first scandal of the government, the XYZ affair, 1797-98. French agents demanded bribes before diplomatic talks could begin. The phase millions for defense and not 1 cent for tribute captured the American outrage. The Quasi War, 1798 to 1800s was a undeclared naval war with France, America's first post-independent conflict. And then Napoleon sells us the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, double the size of the country overnight. Jefferson, the strict constructionalist, had to swallow his own constitutional principles to complete the purchase. Jefferson's view of America was of yeoman farmers and their farms, and that they had designated ones that would go to Washington first of the year, make whatever laws were necessary, go back to their farms, and that was it as far as government control. But he gradually grew into more complicated things. Spain, southern and western front, Spain controlled Florida and the Mississippi River outlet at New Orleans, a stranglehold on Western American commerce. Pinckney's Treaty in 1795 secured navigation rights on the Mississippi and the right to deposit at New Orleans, vital to the Trans-Appalachian economy, and this was quite important. Uh, Spain's slow imperial decline opened opportunities, but also created instability on the southern front. By the mid 1800s, they will have given Mexico their freedom, and then we will take a great chunk of land, almost, if not bigger, than the Louisiana Purchase. We get Texas and New Mexico and California, lot of land that came out of Spain's kind of decline. Native Americans, of course, were another problem. The North, we had the Northwest Treaty, land questions, the Land Ordinance of 1785, and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Articles Congress' greatest achievements created the framework for admitting these states from territories north of the Ohio River into the Union. The Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in the territory, though it was not enforced rigorously, and theoretically protected Native American land rights. A promise immediately broken in practice almost every time. Native tribes in the Northwest, the Miami, the Shawnee, the Delaware, and so on, had not signed the Treaty of Paris and did not consider themselves bound by it. They continued to regard the Ohio Valley as their homeland. So there were a lot of Native Americans that during this period also that tried to make alliances. Little Turtle, who was a member of the Miami tribe, and Blue Jacket, who was Shawnee, organized a pan-tribal confederacy that dealt the United States Army its worst defeat in the entire post-revolutionary period. St. Clair's defeat in November 1791, over 600 soldiers were killed, a disaster later a greater proportion than Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn. Matt Anthony Wayne rebuilt the army and crushed the Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and the Treaty of Greenville, 1795, opened the most of Ohio to American settlement. Britain had been quietly supplying and encouraging Native Americans to join them and fight against the Americans. So basically, Jefferson continued to believe that Native Americans could be civilized and assimilated, but simultaneously promoted policies that accelerated their dispossession. Basically, Tecumseh and his brother would lead another riot against the Americas, and for the War of 1812, in which we take on Britain again, and we'll talk about that next week and how we what we gained out of the War of 1812. Continue with the work. Let's end well. Let's do our best, and we'll talk to you soon.